But everybody else.
It's cemetery left right after the first
Not bad, huh?
Delicious. Back my car up, I'll take the left one.
Oh, my son got really
I'm gonna have to change the website, but I can do that.
Hey, might be the first bracket I won in 11 years.
Yeah, can you put that away?
I took first and last.
Yeah, I saved myself.
All right, you're good, Jason.
Yeah.
Good, need $50.
We're live, Tom?
Yep.
All right.
Yep.
And like Michelle had said, audio.
That's good.
Oh, you want me to?
Yeah.
Welcome to the budget workshop tonight. We're going to get started.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Armazzani. Want to welcome everyone to our second budget workshop tonight for the Board of Education. We are going to work on draft number 1 of expenditures and revenue with a focus on the tax levy. And before I begin, I know we do have some audience members. Budget workshops are work sessions for the board. So this is open dialogue between the Board of Education regarding the budget development process. If there are any questions for folks in attendance, you can ask them during the regular meeting under public comment. In attendance tonight, I won't read everyone, but just to note, our Board of Education, Superintendent, Assistant Superintendent, and then our Board of Education Clerk. And at the bottom, there are a number of items where folks that are watching this live can request answers to their questions or to find additional information, including this presentation. Just a reminder, we have 2 more budget workshops after tonight, and then April 20th will be our budget adoption, with the budget vote being May 19th as well. Tonight, March 12th, is again first draft of the budget. And I want to welcome from Central Business Office, Mrs. Cynthia Wambold, who will be helping answer questions and providing insight into the presentation as we move along. So again, it's open dialogue, ask questions as we go. But at the end, when we do provide some recommendations, we would like to have an opportunity to, dialogue regarding the items we're recommending. All right, so again, going into, I believe now this is our 3rd month in developing the budget. As we've said, from January, we do have guiding principles. These guiding principles have remained. We want to deliver a premier education to all students that our community can afford and will support. We want to provide a well-rounded early kindergarten, pre-kindergarten to 12 educational program that meets all students' needs. And then we want to ensure financial health and sustainability for the district. Those are our 3 guiding principles. So if you recall in January, when Kathy Blackman presented long-range projections, we currently are working on a structural deficit for the current school year, and we had mentioned the areas were special ed costs that were not anticipated, and alternative ed placements for a total of $557,000. It's creeped up a little bit since, but this is a number we're utilizing reserves to cover for this year. And then also in the long-term projection, and this has been a similar scenario, we are back to a point where we're going to need to make some reductions on the expenditure side to balance out with our revenues, because failure to do so is going to lead to future structural deficits as shown here. And the most important point to take from this, I believe, is if you look at the basis below that's used to forecast, it assumes a revenue average of around 2% and expenditures of around 3.6. So if your expenditures exceed your revenue, you have a deficit, and if you project that out over multiple years, you have a structural deficit, which is what we have shown. Cost drivers we identified in January. Again, these are the areas where we're seeing the largest increases and where we're seeing the impact. So last budget meeting, we had our first expenditure report, and at the conclusion of that first draft of our expenditures, we were at around 2.6 million. And we recognized right away that that number was well over what our anticipated revenues were going to be. So we knew we had to, before we came to you with a first draft, we had to reduce that significantly to present a budget, a balanced budget at this point. So tonight we're looking at our first draft based on all the information we have. We feel pretty good about expenditures. Cynthia, is that fair to say at this point?
I would believe so, yes.
Okay. Revenue, however, is still what we think we're going to get based on one side of the government, the executive branch. And we all know what's happening now. There's been obviously a significant impact to the economy with the coronavirus. We are concerned that an on-time budget could be in jeopardy, and that additional state aid could also be in jeopardy. Not only based on state aid, financial issues with the state based on trying to tackle coronavirus, but also we know that the economy in New York is being impacted by this, so we need to be cautious about expecting more than what we currently think we're getting.
That is correct.
So we've said from the beginning, we have a strategy. There's areas that we're going to look to make reductions. We're not filling open positions where we can. We are going to have to make reductions to staffing, we think, at this point. We do not have specifics. We will. We're honing in on those. We are obviously looking at historical use and then going back and making reductions, particularly materials and supplies and equipment. And then we are reducing contracted services. So tonight, that $2.6 million expenditures we have reduced down to 1.5, using the strategies I just mentioned, and I'll highlight a couple areas. When you look at what our revenues are, though, and these are numbers that we've shared with you before, this is where we feel we are right now, and as I mentioned earlier, we don't have a good feel for where that will go. But I highlight appropriated reserves because, as we've said before, that's a 115% increase from the previous year. That's not a model that we can sustain. If anything, reserve use should be going backwards, not getting larger. So, that's an area that we still need to discuss and work on. So when you balance out the two expenditures and revenues, we have a balanced budget right now on paper, barring no terrific unforeseen costs that jump up between now and September, or really July, I guess it's fair to say. So I wanted to put this out there because I know we mentioned we were going to be looking at positions right now. In order to reduce that budget to a balanced, along with other areas, we are looking at reductions of 8 positions, instructional and non-instructional around 10 positions, so a total of 18. I will say that of the 8, 3 of those right now we feel are going to be positions we don't fill. But we don't fill them. It doesn't mean they're not layoffs, but they're not filled, which means they go empty and they are reductions. The other 5 would be layoffs. And then the other 10 positions, we'll look to see from a retirement standpoint, a couple positions may be attrition that we don't fill, but right now, 8 to 9 of them could be layoffs. So there will be potential layoffs at where we are right now based on the current numbers. And again, I'll go back to, we will have more detail at the next meeting, and then by April 9th, we will have specifics.
From the state.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll have numbers from the state too at that point. And I've said this before, unfortunately this is a situation we've been in. I don't like to put up too much information early because it does create panic, and I don't think it's proper for someone to see their position up there without having had a conversation with them personally. So I apologize if it seems ambiguous. It's not meant to be. It's just we want to make sure we're at a final decision, and we want to meet with those people ahead of time too, if that's the decision we end up making. So we want to spend a little bit of time, because tonight we want to talk about tax levy. We have filed our tax levy for 2020-21, but we feel this is a potential area that we should investigate, and we've had this conversation before. So it really, this whole analysis starts with going back to 2012, 2013, which was the first year of the tax levy. So if you recall back in 12, 13, in an effort to control local costs, the governor and the legislature approved a tax levy limit, a cap, and everyone at the time referred to it as the 2% tax cap. And 2% was the number because of the growth factor that was associated with it, but it was assumed to be 2% was the number. So your tax levy couldn't be over 2%. Right, wrong, or indifferent, that's how it was interpreted, and that's how many people felt that it represented. So in 12-13, our tax levy was 5.16. So we could have gone out at 5.16 with 50.1% approval. And again, you know, having been here, and Jeff can certainly speak to this too, and Cynthia, the board was petrified of anything with that didn't have a number of 2 in it. So 5% was not a number, 4%, 3%. We talked about 3.49 at one time, and we landed finally on 2.49 because we recognized that it's still 2, and we don't want to give up all of that, but the board was not comfortable going out over anything 2.49. So in 12-13, you say, well, okay, so what's the big deal? It's 2.67%. Okay. So we could have, at that point in time, collected over $1 million in tax levy. We didn't. We chose to go with 2.49, so we collected over $500,000. And we left over $500,000 not being collected. So if you look at that and say, well, okay, so 1 year you didn't collect $543,000, what's the impact of that? So Cynthia ran a report, and she did this for us last year, but again, when you see it at the point we're at now, where we have a revenue issue, we don't have enough revenue to cover our expenses, the issue becomes more and more obvious as to how pronounced that decision was in 12-13. So when you take all corresponding years from 12-13, where we left over $500,000 on the table, and you add it up, it's a cumulative effect of over $5 million that we have not collected based on that decision in 12-13. So I just want to stop there for a second to make sure that that makes sense. And Cynthia, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to elaborate on that.
I think you said it very well.
So, and then just another chart to show you what the line looks like. So again, I go back to, if we had made the decision in 12-13 to collect all of the tax levy at 5.16, we would have now cumulatively had, and had stayed at the tax levy limit each preceding year, we would be over $5 million in a revenue, more revenue. So as we look at the if we look at the 2021 tax levy calculation, which Cynthia has already filed and has calculated, again, we are at 1.94, below the 2%, I use in quotes, and we are generating with that 1.94% $473,000 of additional revenue. Now, as you've heard, between salaries, special education costs, BOCES contracted services, health insurance, we blew past $473,000 a long time ago. And now knowing that state aid is not something that we can feel abundantly comfortable with, we come back to the question, which the last three budget cycles we've had conversations around: do we exceed the tax levy limit? We feel like we're in a position where we need to have this conversation again. And I can say on the record that for the last 3 years, we've said, no, let's not exceed the tax levy limit. And there was a very good reason for that. Number one, and most importantly, was there were rebate checks that the state would submit to taxpayers if their schools stayed within the tax levy limit. That program that we know of right now is not being re-upped. So that's gone. Which now takes that punitive measure of exceeding your tax levy limit off the table, because folks are not going to lose their rebate check. Yeah, it's been punitive.
Absolutely.
So we said, okay, and you know, what would scenarios look like above 1.94 to generate additional revenue, knowing that we have we have a revenue issue, and B, if we restart our revenue, whatever percentage it is, moving forward, that's built into the tax levy permanently. So we would basically be, jump-starting our tax levy, and then preceding years, they would all be based off of that. And I think in an earlier presentation, we have a pretty good idea of what our tax levy is gonna be the next several years.
Right, we don't see it varying much from the 2% amount, assuming that the CPI allowable growth factor is 2%.
Which based on the town of Union,
CPIs?
CPI is
It's gonna be
1.81 this year, and
It's gonna be
obviously, there's certainly potential change for CPI, but when we did it, we always assume in the outer years 2% because we don't know what it's going to be. And it would stay around that amount. We don't anticipate that your capital levy, which is really what's going to impact this, is going to change very much over the next several years. However, I should point out that there is the potential for an impact in maybe 2 or 3 years if TRS or ERS goes up because of the market, the changes that are happening right now, which is very likely. You might get in.
Why, if you go back to 12-13, the 5-point number.
Right, you
was
might
built
get
in
into
there
the
for the tax levy.
situation, right, like Mr. Lemmer is referencing, where you have an allowable TRS, ERS exemption. So we wouldn't have said that a week ago, but now we're definitely, potentially in that territory. So if that happens, then you would be higher than 2%.
so we're not projecting, a tax levy above 2% for the next few years. We foresee or can foreshadow a tough economic year next year. The state has already said they have a $6 billion deficit. If this continues economically, we think there's gonna be potential issue for state aid in coming years. This could be a year where we make this decision to ask the voters to exceed the tax levy limit. A, knowing that it's not going to impact their wallets in the form of a rebate check. B, we would need 60% voter approval. We've done very well recently, and not to say that means it's automatic, but we've been supported, and we've had community members come and say repeatedly, why don't you ask for more? Go out over the tax levy limit. Let the voters decide whether or not they support that.
Right.
So like I've said, the last 3 years with that rebate check, that was a real, to me, break on that. Without it though, and I'll synthesize that, and we talked about this, and I don't want to be dramatic, but I think at the end of the day, when you go right back to what we said are our guiding principles, if we don't bump revenue locally, then it's going to be hard to keep delivering a premier education. I mean, we are already making decisions in this current budget that is going to really impact a premier education. And then we say we want to have a well-rounded program, not with the current revenues. We are going to impact a well-rounded program. And then number 3, reserve use of 115% increase from year to year is not a good model. That's not the direction we want to go. So when you look at our guiding principles, we've made reductions, but now we come back to, but it's the revenue. It's a revenue issue. It's a revenue issue. This could be the year that we ask our voters to support an additional tax levy limit. Yes?
Maybe you get to this later, but I know that in previous meetings we talked about that possibly they could re-up the rebate. Is that, do we know anything about what the likelihood of that?
Well,
No, we met with legislators and we didn't get the impression, actually we thought they were surprised that it wasn't gonna be re-upped. Is that fair to say?
That was how I interpreted their reaction.
And if they were going to do that, is there a point in time that we would know?
I believe that if they're going to do that, we would know by when they settle the state budget. So at the same time, we would know state aid. Hopefully, that will be April 1st.
Right.
But I'm also reading that the likelihood of that's not very good either.
Right.
Because of
That's right.
Last
coronavirus
month.
issues.
Right, I'm just thinking,
No.
I'm thinking that our community is going to be impacted financially.
Yep.
And so I'm wondering what the legislators will do to try and
Mitigate.
Put it in place.
Yeah,
put it
right,
in use,
whether
yeah,
it's
no.
through that or some other way.
The problem is on the state level, okay, you have to understand, we're $6 billion in the hole. That's why they're not gonna give us the rebate. The projections for the next, unless the federal government steps in and does something about healthcare, which nobody wants to address that, the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Unless they do it, healthcare costs are gonna keep climbing just as they are for us, okay? There is no way that it's sustainable. The $6 billion, the next year's projected is gonna be $8.5 billion next year. The state's gonna be in a hole because we are giving healthcare to people who can't afford it. So we're giving it to them for free so that taxpayers have to pay. It's not sustainable, okay?
Thank
So, you know what I'm saying? So
Thank you.
the projection, the chances that they're gonna give this rebate in the next couple of years are pretty slim.
Thank you. And the other question, and maybe you get to this later, is I remember when we had talked about this before, we were able to give some estimates based on like average household income? How?
Oh, the impact, yeah,
Mhm.
yep.
Yeah, that's coming later.
We can do that.
Okay.
Yeah, because, and you'll see in a recommendation, we're not ready to recommend,
How much?
yeah,
Okay.
but
Thank you.
yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
We have
That
to
I
exceed the
think
limit.
we need to be a little mindful of, because we made some decisions with that rebate and when it was intact, is that double whammy. So we're not getting our rebate and we have to pay more, like what almost would have been a little easier when the rebate could have kind of offset a little bit of a, we're going out a little bit above, but we're getting that rebate check, but
Don't,
I
you
just-
wouldn't get the rebate check if you went out above.
Right.
You get nothing.
right,
You'd
okay,
lose.
good,
So that's
good
why we
point.
didn't do it.
Good
So
point,
you-
yeah.
So not only, so
missed- yeah, I
conceptually,
missed-
you're asking people to pay more in taxes, $100 a household, let's say,
Right,
and lose $400, $500, $600 checks.
right.
So that's the double whammy. Now it's,
Right.
there's no
Check.
checks
And
out there,
it- and it
period.
might go up.
Right, there's no checks out there, period.
That's the combination I meant.
But
Just
again,
that
it's
we
an
have
expense
to-
for the state to run
Yeah.
this program.
Everything I'm reading says that they're probably not gonna reinstate those checks.
Yeah, I wouldn't think so either,
Okay,
so.
but,
Can't do
I
it.
mean,
Can't
on
do
the
it.
other hand,
Feeling that fit.
Can't sustain.
what's happening over the last,
Can't sustain.
4 weeks or so is gonna probably
Impact it more.
the economy, even locally, I don't know, I mean, but, it's already impacting other areas of the country. So it's still a little bit of a dice roll, right? But, I mean, and this community is maybe not in as bad shape as other communities in the southern tier, but it seems like, given the fact that they're not giving those checks anymore, and if that was the only factor, I think we would, could almost say, yeah, we should do this, but like I said, we have to determine what the right number is and whether we,
Yeah, and to your question, Vicki, we would absolutely want to see what the average, we would want to do that analysis so that we can, at least speak to, here's what that's going to do for the average homeowner in the town of Union.
Right.
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 Knowing though that there's still two other factors to the tax rate, that impacts the levy is only a piece of it, but we recognize that if we're going out over the tax levy limit, people will automatically zone in on, so how much is that gonna cost me, right? So we get it,
Exactly.
we get it. But I go back to, and again, it's not a cat and mouse game, it's not a carrot and stick. We want these things, we've made reductions, and Jeff and I are saying, we've made reductions. I mean, we don't feel as if we have all these extras that are just floating around that we can say, well, yeah, we have this, we have that. We have really good programs. And the return on investment of our programs has been outstanding. When you look at what we spend per pupil compared to other schools, and then you look at what you get for that investment, it's extraordinary. But we're back to that point where revenues are X, expenditures are Y, they're not in alignment, something's gotta come off the table in order to balance the budget. So if we go back to the revenue side and ask community for support, I think it would have to be if that rebate was no longer on the table, because if it was, I don't know how we could do that, honestly, so.
I can't believe we're given the fact that those rebate checks are ending this year, I can't believe that, we would be the only district considering this.
Well, in our conversation.
It depends, I know, but.
Well, in the conversation with local legislators, it was funny because the conversation came up and it was brought up, well, you mean you're gonna put more burden on local taxpayers? And our point was, we're not trying to put a burden on local taxpayers, it's a revenue issue. We don't have enough money to pay for what we're trying to provide and as it was stated very clearly back in 2012-13, hey, if your community wants to pay more money, then exceed the tax levy, let them vote it and approve it, and have at it. I mean, Governor Cuomo kind of, joked at that. Hey, you want it? Ask them if they'll support it. The rebate check put a huge, huge disincentive to do that. So, to me, because I remember a couple years ago, it was 0.89?
Yeah.
And at the time, we had a couple board members say, that's when we should have went out. Yeah,
That
but,
was one of
yeah, but we had the disincentive of the rebate check, so.
So the net effect was like 8 to 10% tax increase, basically, by losing the rebate check. And
Right,
it's like,
right.
I mean, it was
right.
pretty
I don't know
heavy.
why we didn't, I just.
So I do think educating, but also at the same point, here's what we're trying to do, the numbers don't lie, to me, it's not a hard sell. But remember that of the 11,000 people that make up our school district, only about 2,500 of them have children, give or take, in a school district. So we have a whole nother population that doesn't necessarily use the services, but will pay for it, so we do have to be cognizant of that. But again, we're here to advocate for the school. We're here to advocate for what the families that bring their kids to the school need, so.
Well, the other thing I guess I want to point out is, let's say we went out at 4.5%, right? Just looking at that table there. Okay. Well, now, if you want to keep your programs, right, you still have built into here that you're taking, over $1 million out of reserve. Okay. So if you just, if you just offset that with the extra tax levy money, right, you've still got the same issues that the same actions you have to take, right? So, and if you want to restore, if you want to not take those actions, then you still have to take $1.1 million out of reserve. So there's a balance there in terms of, what actions don't you have to take, and then, what do you take out of reserve still, because you're not gonna make it all the way.
Right.
And that's a big number, 4.5 is a big number. So,
Yeah.
Can you remind me what happens if we don't get that 60%? What happens to the tax
Then
levy?
you go back to contingency budget. You go back to the contingency budget and you can't exceed what you spent last year.
no, you
Twice.
go back to
Go back to
contingency.
You go back to the voters again, but you can't exceed, right, what you spent last year.
So you
No.
get two
If they don't
chances.
approve it.
Yeah.
If it's defeated, number one, you can go back,
Yes.
ask same or amended, or you could adopt the contingency, but the contingency would be this right here, Melinda. Be a zero increase.
It's the prior year's tax levy, that's what I wanted to
You
know.
have to cut
See,
$474,000.
I mean, you could go back, right, you can go back and say, okay, we're gonna lower the tax levy limit, right? And then you re-vote, if the vote passes, then or you could go back at the same number, and if the vote passes, but if the vote gets defeated, then you're automatically in contingency.
Which is second.
We would probably
On
go
the second
back to
time.
1.94 and ask for the 50.1.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yep.
Historically, we've always had really good support,
Yeah.
even the people, like you said, who are in their 60s and 70s, okay, who don't have any children in the district any longer. I truly believe they would be willing to support, like, even up to 3%. okay, because they realize that these children are going to be taking care of them, okay? They're gonna be taking care of them in the nursing homes, in the hospitals, in the jobs, okay? They're gonna be taking care of them, and they want them to have the best education, okay? I think this community is, I don't know if it's rare, but they're very supportive, okay? And, you know, the vast, you know, I'm 62, and I know most of my friends don't have, my family and acquaintances, don't have people in the district, but they're willing to support 2.5 to 3%.
You know,
On the other hand, when you do go out over the cap, more people show up that don't show up when the budget's not controversial, so it's.
yeah, there's some factors, and we just wanted to put this out here tonight to say, for the first time, I think, ever, we're saying,
It's
maybe this is
feasible.
the year we should consider it. And I know the percentage, and we have to do some more work and get you some more data, but I just wanna put in your ear, we're thinking this is a year we need to seriously consider this, and whatever that number is, we'll come to. So thank you for at least hearing that, and again, we'll definitely have some more work to do on that. So I wanna finish up and then answer any additional questions, and any other areas you wanna discuss with some preliminary recommendations. So first of all, and this has been a standing recommendation since, you know, we had to make some decisions back in 12-13 or 13-14, but since 13-14, we've said, we have a policy, the board has a policy, 3910, regarding fund balance. You have a legal ability to keep up to 4% unassigned, unallocated each year, and it's really a barometer of financial health. And I think for the last several years, we've been averaging 3.5 to 3.75, Cynthia?
Somewhere in that region,
Yeah.
yes.
That number's starting to slide because obviously as we have unexpected expenses, it's eating into that. And I'm not saying, hey, you have a policy, you have to follow it, it's your policy. But we had it for a reason, and the further away from 4% we get, the closer to that financial stress we also get. So our recommendation is, in order to keep this percentage as close to 4 as possible, we need to make decisions on the expenditure side in order to have money to save.
That 4%, does that includes the capital reserve?
No,
No.
No.
4%, it's your fund balance divided into your next year's budget.
So, you know, what I,
You know what I meant?
Yeah.
But no, it's just.
Because we're
it's just
taking
straight-
money out of that.
It's just straight fund balance,
Okay.
unassigned,
Unassigned.
undesignated,
It's unassigned.
as a percentage of your
Right. Okay.
approved next year's budget. That's how you calculate it.
I equate it when I'm talking to kids as it's cash in your wallet.
Right.
You haven't spent it, you don't have it in a savings account, you could use it, you don't have to. That's what this is, it's cash in your wallet that you haven't used yet. You could do something with it, but you haven't. So if you don't have any cash in your wallet, which, you know, I'm sure we've all experienced it before, it can be difficult. And that's the issue with not having that money in your wallet. So our second recommendation, again, you'll see there's no number yet, is exceeding the tax levy limit. Now, you could come back and say, no, then our recommendation would be go out at the tax levy limit of 1.94. So, but again, this is our initial recommendation.
No, I have a loaded question, because in the past, when we talked about this, it was not the central business office recommendation to do it. What's the central business office's position on that?
I'm not gonna say one way or the other, because I really think that the board knows the community the best.
Yeah.
And I think that you have to take into consideration what the community response will be. What I will say is that times are not going to get better. I feel like I have a little doom and gloom show. You were in your budget for next year, we'll round it to $1.2 million of reserves. And that would be using over half of your usable reserves that are left to use. And so that's very concerning, and I've already said that would mean that you would already be starting the next budget cycle with over $1.2 million of cuts, and it would only be higher than that. So what you can chip away at now will only help the future, because the future is not getting any better.
I'm not, I don't mean to put you on the spot,
That's okay.
but whenever we had that discussion, you know, CBO was pretty vocal about, no, you shouldn't do that. You know,
Right.
It was tied to the rebate check.
Well,
Tied
yeah,
to the
no,
rebate
right,
check.
I
And that's, the
understand.
net effect of it was, I mean, that was always your stance and ours, I mean, it just, that's, you're asking for a lot in that, in those scenarios.
You answered that very well, by the way.
If we go out and we get voter approval, then what happens next year?
Or,
Would we, I mean, where would that put us next year?
we'd still be at, the tax levy formula would flow through for next year, let's say it's exactly 2%. But the 2% that we start at for that, if we don't go to exceed it that year, the base of our tax levy
Would be
is up
higher.
significantly higher.
Yeah.
So that goes back to that.
So it's that number, Vicky, plus whatever we agreed to over here, and then the next year's calculations based off of
So
that.
you
Or we
Compound.
could do it,
Compound.
we could,
It's like
we could-
compounded interest.
we could do it again,
Yeah, you can do it any,
Right.
Oh,
you
you
can do it
could.
consecutive years if you wanted to.
yeah, okay. Okay, thank you.
But I think in Jason,
But
next
You're starting with a
discussion
bigger
was-
base, so the 2%, a
Right.
bigger base is a bigger number.
Right,
But our sentiment is if you do it, it's probably just, we're looking at 1 year
Yeah.
to do it.
Yeah.
Consecutive years is probably just
and then,
not,
Yeah,
well, then you're.
that's a tough sell.
Yeah.
Yep.
balance.
That's a tough sell.
And that's why I started off with 12-13. I think in hindsight, if we could go back in 12-13, 9 years later, we would have said, yeah, of course we're going out of 5.16. But if you can imagine the environment at that time, 5.16 was not going to be, I'm pretty confident, I shouldn't say that definitively. That would have been a very difficult sell. It was right after the flood.
was it
Flood.
3.49 in 11,
11,
12?
right.
One
No,
point-
it was 5.94.
No, oh, that's right. No, the year, actually,
Oh,
that's
the-
the year before.
Oh, the year before, I think we went out at
But
2.5.
that wasn't.
There was no
that
levy.
wasn't the that was not,
There's no
the
limit.
levy limit wasn't there.
Right,
Right,
it
right.
didn't exist, yeah,
I
right.
think we got out 2.5. I'll
Or
have to go back.
1.5 or
I'm not sure.
2.5. one or the other.
So that's the second recommendation. And the third recommendation, and I put this information a while ago, we have a purchase plan to keep our buses, our fleet up to date. Significant aid on these. It makes it a no-brainer financially.
Plus, it's good to get 95%.
Our recommendation is to continue with that purchase plan. 3 large buses, 1 large bus equipped with wheelchairs, because we do have a population of students that obviously require special transportation services. The do not exceed is $509,477. This is a separate proposition that voters vote on, along with the budget. We have had high success. This typically is as successful, if not a couple percentage points higher than the actual budget over the years. So again, our recommendation is to keep with that. And then Mike always provides kind of the plan. These are the buses we would take offline, and you can see the miles. And then we would get, we usually get trade-in value, and then you subtract that off of the cost. It's spread out over 5 years. It's aided heavily. It's the best investment we can make financially because of all those factors.
That's a no-brainer.
And we have done a study, I'll just throw it out there. A bus, typical buses in the Northeast, the cost to maintain them starts exceeding the value at about 120 to 140,000 miles. So that number Mike picks, that's not just out of thin air. That's when the cost to maintain becomes more than just buying new and paying for a new bus. So, and you'll note that that's where we are with those 4.
Jason, I can't remember with the changes to the BOCES aid, is that affect this? Or these would still be repeatable for BOCES?
These are their own transportation aid.
So
Yep.
that's not part of that?
Nope.
Good. I didn't think it was. Good, okay.
So.
Great.
So those are our recommendations, and I want to just stop there. Obviously, we can go back. This gives us time to ask any questions, any feedback, thoughts. And then for anyone who's watching, I always put this up here if there's questions. We answer questions as they come in, and then we share those with you. So I will stop there and ask the board if there's any additional questions you have.
Was that, the bus aid, was that rolled into the foundation aid? Remember they consolidated that?
Part of
Right.
transportation.
It's different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's different.
No, and we didn't wanna bring up foundation aid, that's a whole nother topic that we're working on. We're not sure what the what the final decision's gonna be on combining all those aids into foundation aid. So we didn't wanna bring that up tonight, as we brought that up, I think, in an earlier presentation. Any questions? Feedback? And obviously, as your thoughts come up, just email us, call. Our next budget workshop is in 2 weeks, and so by next, we'll obviously start providing more information regarding specific reductions, and also hopefully we'll have some more information from the state, if we're in session.
Well, maybe we'll know if we're going, if they're going to be there, and
True, good point,
we'll know if we're going to maybe have an on-time budget.
right.
Good point.
Yeah, there was some concern over that, honestly, about an on-time budget because of the situation that's going on right now, so.
I wouldn't expect that you would have new numbers until April 1st or later, even if it is on time, so that's usually where, that's usually the time frame that occurs in the past couple years.
So, as far as the tax levy goes, what are the next steps to making the decision as to how much, right? And, how do we use that money, right, if that decision is made? Given the fact that, we're still gonna have to take money out of reserves and,
Absolutely.
some of these, strategies, how does it affect those, right, I guess.
Yeah.
It will need a little more specificity.
Oh, yeah, no,
Right.
I think we could run some analysis to say, here's what the impact would be. So we could run a new budget, a mock budget, with a new tax levy amount. We could possibly project out a couple years what that new amount would look like, do a forecast. We can certainly get information regarding, so I could take each of those levels that I showed and say, okay, the average taxpayer in the town of Union, average taxpayer in the town of Maine, I think we use $100,000 home, that's the average, and say, here's what that scenario would look like at each tax levy.
Right.
Is that the kind of information?
Yes.
Yeah, and,
Yeah.
what, programmatically, some of those, because you spoke to that very eloquently, Jason, in terms of to maintain Premier, but what, if we did some increase and some out of fund balance and some cuts, I mean, if it was
Yep.
that, what,
Right.
I think we
Yeah.
need some specific.
Okay.
I think that's the same thing
that too.
I'm asking,
Yep.
right, is,
You wanna see so what are we getting for the tax levy? For one, we're not using, I'll say right off the top, we wouldn't be using $1.2 million in reserves.
Right.
And that would be one of the major reasons for doing it.
Yes.
Because as Cynthia said, we're already butting up to, we're using too much reserve. And I know that's probably a hard sell, right? Oh, so you're taxing us more to keep your reserves flush? And that's the part of,
Right.
people don't necessarily understand what we're dealing with right now.
I don't think we avoid using some reserve.
No,
Right.
absolutely.
That's
Yeah,
fine.
we have to
That's
use
fine.
some
Just
reserves,
making that
absolutely.
point.
Yeah, no.
But, maybe we don't have to make 18 reductions.
Correct.
Right?
Maybe one way to look at it is for the board to determine how much reserves you do feel comfortable using, and then any additional amount that you tax the taxpayers would essentially save those programs, so that it looks at it from a perspective of saving some sort of program versus saving reserves.
And we could give you the programs, and then, maybe that's the
Yes.
conversation,
Yes.
almost a
Don't forget,
triage.
we're also looking at other areas, health insurance and things, so.
Right.
That's gotta weigh into this over the next 3 or 4 weeks, so.
You haven't made any assumptions on health insurance and the revenue. In fact, is that the same, spending, is that the same spending number as we saw the last time, or?
No,
is
it's
there a
down,
bit-
down to 1 point.
More
For
of
health
a-
insurance or for?
No,
everything.
for everything.
Right, so it's down 1 point, if you go to 2.6 to 1.5. That was the one slide, Jason showed those two slides at the beginning. We came out originally was 2.66 million
Right, no,
increase, now we're at 1.515.
right.
Yeah. So those
The
are
1.515,
Aligns with our revenues.
right, it also assumes those reductions.
Yes.
Yes,
Yep.
correct. That's a great strategy, we can certainly put that together too. You know, how much are we comfortable using reserve-wise?
Tax reductions.
You know, we could talk about, I mean, we definitely didn't wanna be more than we used last year.
Right, but last year we had some money left over, right? Or was it the year before? I don't.
Year before.
Right, year before, yeah. I don't remember what that was, I think it was around,
So, okay, we can certainly put that package together.
I'm not saying we're gonna have money left over, I'm just saying that, you know,
Yeah,
that offsets the reserves are a little bit, that happens.
okay. Any other questions?
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Cynthia, thank you very
Thank you,
much.
Cynthia.
Thank you.
Tom,
Happy to be
thank you, and Richie, thank you for tonight's live broadcast. Again, this concludes our workshop. If anyone does have questions, please feel free to reach out to us at this information, this website, or call Jeff or I as well. Thank you. Thanks, Cynthia.
Sure.
Thank you.
See you later.